A lot of things are said about the French. One of them is that the French are rude and arrogant. And my favorite one is that French people hate Americans. And that's simply not true. We hate everybody. You take it personally. But kidding aside, of course, the French don't hate Americans. Actually, the vast majority of visitors that we talk to tell us how welcoming and friendly the French are. So in this video, Colleen and I are going to uncover the 10 biggest misconceptions about France and the French. We'll cover things about wine, food, and fashion, and we'll tell you the truth. Allez, on y va.
I often hear people say that French people are rude, but that's just a big misconception. Yes, they can be impatient and they can communicate their displeasure with a very simple look. But what's true is that French people are far more formal than Americans, and they have very defined rules with greetings and politeness. Parisians can be direct and blunt compared to North Americans, but think about the reputation of New Yorkers. Like Parisians, they're often busy and focused, but that doesn't mean they're rude, even if it feels like they are. Most people who visit Paris have great experiences with the French and go home wondering why people would say otherwise. Someone recently told me that Americans are like dogs and French people are like cats, and that's a great analogy. Both are awesome, but they each require a very different approach. So when in France, dial in your casualness and excitement just a little bit, start with bonjour, and you'll see that French people are very fun and super friendly.
The next misconception is about the French people being lazy or always on vacation. Now, what is true is that French people are much more into work-life balance. They tend to respect time off and are present to the people and beauty around them. They take actual lunch breaks. It would not be proper or French to eat at your desk. They will go enjoy a meal with a glass of wine with a colleague or relax in a park with a good book over a break. And many businesses close between 12 p.m. and 2 p.m. to accommodate that cultural habit. And they also have 6 weeks of vacation per year to travel and enjoy friends and family. The French are actually very productive when it comes to work, and they believe in taking breaks when needed. French life is not about how much you work or how busy you are. It's more about how much of life you get to enjoy.
Another misconception is that French people can be snobbish or arrogant, but that hasn't been our experience at all. What is true is that they're very proud of their culture, history, and traditions, and they can be very passionate when it comes to culture and habits. There are things in other cultures that are no big deal at all, but they're very important in France. For instance, the way we talk to one another is far more formal, especially when meeting someone for the first time. Other examples are with food and craftsmanship. The French take great pride in the quality and presentation of food they prepare and the skills and attention to detail in stone or woodworking. There are literally national contests and prizes for who is the best craftsman across many categories in the country. And when you're proud of something, you tend to want to let people know. And there's often a fine line between bragging and being proud, but rest assured, for the most part, French people are very proud of their country and their culture. And once you know them, French people are very approachable and fun.
And of course, I've heard many times that French people hate Americans. And that's simply not true. Actually, the French have a lot of admiration for Americans. What you'll find here is that there is a lot of American culture that is embedded in France, like in music and food and all over media. When we ask restaurant and hotel owners if they like Americans as customers, the answer is always a resounding yes. They say that they love how friendly and nice Americans are. Honestly, I think the French may be a little jealous of the American freedom of self-expression. They love that. Now, that doesn't mean that you're not going to encounter someone that doesn't like Americans, but that will be the exception, not the rule.
Another misconception is about French people always being on strike or protesting something. That is also not true. Now, granted, there are a lot more strikes and protests here in France, far more than the US, and especially over the last 30 years. But going on strike is a right in France, and people like to exercise that right if they have demands for the government. And the French tend to participate more actively in the democratic process than Americans. They understand the policies and who represents what, and they demand that their tax money is spent in ways that matter to them. There have been a lot of extra strikes this year with people protesting the new retirement age. That's a big deal that affects many people, and they deserve to be heard. And while it's very inconvenient for visitors when it happens, they're all scheduled in advance. We know when and where they're going to happen, and for the most part, they're very peaceful marches. And generally, they're all right back to work the next day.
Another thing that we hear is that French people don't speak English or they choose not to.
I would like to buy a hamburger.
We've actually been surprised by how many French people speak English these days, especially in tourist areas. We also had it happen a couple of times when a French person didn't speak any English at all, but that's very rare. Most of the time, they'll know at least a few words to being able to communicate. Now, I can tell you that it feels strange to hear your own voice in a foreign language. And it can feel really vulnerable when you don't feel confident speaking another language. It's the same for them. And what is also true is that assuming that they speak English may rub a few the wrong way. You should always make an effort with bonjour and merci and ask politely if they speak English. Parlez-vous anglais?
Another misconception is that French food is fancy, complicated, and really expensive. And it makes sense to feel that way. For the most part, the French restaurants in any town outside of France are the fancy and expensive places in town. But once you're here, you'll find French restaurants at every street corner serving simple dishes that are very affordable. And if you think about it, there's nothing fancy about a beef bourguignon or a French onion soup. They're basically beef stew and a soup with cheese on top. And you'll find that most dishes served in restaurants in France are very basic dishes with funny names.
Poisson du jour is a loup de mer bleu en verson, and also serve a luminette rouge and soufflé petit de fierte du pont grenier.
And that's why we did a video explaining what's in many of the must-try meals you'll find in a French restaurant. One of the things we're often surprised about is how affordable restaurants are here in France compared to the US. In France, food is a human right. There are literally regulations about how much a boulangerie can charge for a baguette. There are great meals and great restaurants available at all price levels. And aside from the fact that the tax and service are already included in the meal, aka the price on the menu is what you pay, the price of the food itself is actually very affordable.
Another misconception is that French people eat pastries and cheese all day long and they're still thin. That's also a big misconception. People that eat pastries and cheese all day long, well, they look like me, a little plump in the midsection. Most French people watch what they eat, just like anyone else. There are well-defined meal times in France, and French people generally don't snack in between. They thoroughly enjoy what they have and don't need to overdo it. Eating pastries in France is an indulgence, not a daily thing. We'll eat a croissant on weekends once in a while, but that's certainly not a daily thing. And while we eat a lot of cheese in France, the quantity we eat has a lot to do with that. French people are very careful with portions. Huge portions are very uncommon, and eating in between meals, aka snacking, is not a French habit. So when French people are skinny, it's because they watch what they eat.
And one of my favorite misconceptions is that French people dress really well and wear designer clothes all the time. There are a lot of stereotypes about French fashion, like women dressing like models every day and changing outfits multiple times a day. And shows like Emily in Paris don't help people understand the reality.
I'm Emily, your new neighbor.
Enchanté.
I can tell you from living here that this is far from the truth. Most Parisians wear comfortable clothes to navigate the city. There are a lot of stairs and cobblestones, and you're more likely to see a woman wearing sneakers or other comfortable shoes than high heels. Like Boston or New York, if they need heels, they'll put them in a bag and carry them to their destination. And while Paris is known for fashion, that doesn't mean French people are all fashion models. In fact, we have run into many fashion models on their way to shows or shoots, and they don't dress like fashion models off the runway either. If you want to make an impression in the high-rent district, go for it. But for the most part, the people you see dressed up fancy are tourists. The French will have a well-coordinated but simple wardrobe of classic items that they can mix and match, and classic tones and colors that are easy to match are an essential part of their wardrobe. This is where the elegance comes from. It's a practical simplicity that we refer to as chic.
And finally, another big misconception is that French people know everything there is to know about wine. While it's true that the average French person is more accustomed to drinking wine than people from other countries, it doesn't make every French person a wine connoisseur. I know it can feel intimidating to order a bottle of wine with a name you can't pronounce, but take my word for it. The vast majority of French people couldn't tell you the first thing about that wine either. I know a lot of Americans that know or appreciate wine far more than I do. What I suggest is that you ask the waiter to recommend something with the dishes you just ordered. They'll usually suggest something that's great for you. And since they aren't working for tips, they're not gonna suggest the most expensive bottle on the list. But honestly, most French people just know the basics with wine. You know, like red with meat, white with fish, and you know, champagne every day. Outside of that, they're just like you and me. So don't be intimidated with wine around French people. Many of them don't know shit about wine either. Just order what you like.